Good afternoon, everyone. We're officially starting the Q&A session at the moment. My name is Doron Sher. I work with Paul Mason. The people on your screen really need no introduction to you. Professor Tim Noakes from South Africa, Dr. Gary Fettke, who's really from another country. He's from Tasmania. Rod Tayler, who's down in Melbourne, and Paul Mason, who's organised this whole conference. So just the first thing is, Paul, thank you so much for organising what it really has been a wonderful session so far, and we're looking forward to watching the rest of the videos. Now, guys, if you can send through some questions on the live chat, we'll get through as many of them as we can. Tim, you and Paul were just chatting there about some of the conspiracy theories, and unfortunately, this is actually not conspiracy theory; it's true conspiracy. So, do you want to maybe give us a little bit of a summary of where you think we're up to right now?
Yeah, thank you, Doron, and welcome to everyone this morning. It's this morning in Cape Town, maybe a little bit later in Australia. Yeah. When I gave the lecture, I gave it on the basis of what I'd been researching for the last about 9 months or so, which of course follows a lot of other research. But it became very clear to me that the idea that cholesterol causes heart disease is completely bogus. It was found guilty without ever being put on trial. It was just accepted. And Ansel Keys was the first guy who hid the data. And there have been something like 30 or 40 other attempts to prove that cholesterol causes heart disease and low-fat diets reverse heart disease. And they've essentially all failed. And no one has really taken the time to say, well, they've all failed, so therefore surely we should move on to something else. And what in my talk I tried to draw attention to was the fact that it's not whether saturated fat is associated epidemiologically with heart disease. It's not, but that's not the issue, because, well, it's not associated. But even if it were, there's so much other evidence that we should be focusing on, and I wanted people to focus on all the other evidence. And what I show, and what Nina Teicholz show and Gary Taubes show, is that the problem was that in the 1960s there were two.
It seems like Tim may have frozen, so we'll wait a couple of seconds to see if we can get him back.
Doron, that's just proof that there is a conspiracy. That's just proof that there is a conspiracy. Every time you start speaking out about it, these silent forces rise up and try and shut us all up. But luckily, when we hand the baton from one to each other.
Gary, I'm actually going to ask you the next question, if you don't mind. I know you've got the conspiracy theory.
Talk about conspiracies. Yeah, it's not conspiracy; they're facts. And every time everything in nutrition, I've said, we've taken for granted. It's a paradigm. It's what we were taught. Every single topic I've actually touched upon just collapses like a house of cards. Whether or not it's cholesterol, sugar, carbohydrates, fiber, salt, fasting being dangerous. All of them just keep collapsing when you put them under scrutiny. And that's what this group has done over a long period of time now, is just more and more scrutiny. The whole myths about diabetes being caused by, fat, it's all absolute nonsense or non-science. But so that was just continuing on from Tim there.
Look, I think we all agree with you. There are specific questions on the Q&A, and I might ask you about this one. Do you have a thought process on seed oils versus fructose? Is one worse than the other? How are they different in terms of causing insulin resistance?
So you cut out for the first half of that question. It's something versus fructose.
Seed oils. Sorry, Tim, you dropped out for a little while, so we've moved on, but I will come back to you to get the rest of that answer if you don't mind.
Sure, thanks, Doron.
All right. So, Gary, you've got an interest in seed oils as well as an interest in fructose.
Well, I think it's in my talks on inflammation. And I only ever describe what I call a model or a hypothesis of inflammation based on nutrition. And it can't ever be proven, it can't ever be disproven. But effectively, I describe it as the combination of glucose, like refined carbohydrates, fructose, and polyunsaturated seed oils have come together in a perfect storm. And in a nutshell, I describe it that the sugar, the carbs, and the fructose are the kindling of a fire, and the polyunsaturated oils are the match. And as Tim was alluding to in the discussion beforehand, you can have high consumption of carbohydrate and get away with it. You might develop obesity, you might develop diabetes, you might develop some insulin resistance because of that ongoing glucose and carbohydrate load compounded by fructose and its effect in the liver. But when you add in the seed oils, then they're prone to oxidation. And the trouble is that the fat in our body, whether or not it's intracellular, whether or not it's in the cell membrane, the mitochondrial membrane, every single structure of our cells that contains fat, is the amount of fat in it is determined by our dietary intake over a period of time. And so where we were 50, 100 years ago, we had very, very low levels of the polyunsaturated oils in our body, particularly the linoleic acid, which is the omega-6. We now have 20 to 30%, depending on which way you measure it, of the fat in our bodies is linoleic acid or omega-6, which is prone to oxidation. And I think that's the runaway train. So the three things, sugar, refined carbs, and the polyunsaturated oils. But one of the kickers for me was that in 1972, there was a great article related to the polyol pathway. So we know fructose is bad, we know that glucose over a long amount, but if we have excessive carbohydrate in our diet and if we are insulin resistant, then the polyol pathway, instead of converting 3% of glucose to fructose, is actually 30%. So when we up that polyol pathway, that 30% conversion of all glucose to fructose is just a massive of inflammatory tissue that hits the body. And I think that's the big problem. Again, the carbs, the sugar, that's the kindling, that's the fuel source for it. But until we actually put in those industrial seed oils into the equation and the amounts we've done, that's inflammation. And inflammation sits under every single component of health. Or disease, probably.
All right, thanks, Gary. Paul, I know you've been doing a lot of research. There's a lot of people that are promoting, Mediterranean-style diets and having lots and lots of olive oil and monounsaturated oils. Can you just give us a little bit of your thoughts on that? Because I know you don't think that they're necessarily all as safe as what they're made out to be. I can't hear you, Paul. We need somebody with sign language next to you, maybe.
So I think it all comes down
to
what your comparator is. And if you're comparing a poison to an even worse poison, then it's going to come out smelling of roses. And I think this is essentially what the story has done with the Mediterranean diet. And the way I see it, it's become a halfway house for trying to bridge the gap between the two camps, between those who are absolutely scared, petrified of saturated fat, and those people who absolutely love seed oils. And I think I have to appreciate the urge of these two groups to try and meet in the middle. But at the end of the day, one of these groups is right, and having a consensus opinion around the Mediterranean diet is false science. The reason that seed and vegetable oils are so bad is, as Gary said, they have a tendency to oxidize. Their chemical structure means they have a double bond, which means that they generate oxidative stress, oxidative compounds. We ingest them. We actually absorb them into our body, and we can actually see them directly cause fatty liver and other things like this. And olive oil is a 70% oleic acid, which is monounsaturated, which means it has a single double bond prone to this oxidative stress. It means it's not as bad as the polyunsaturated, but in no way is it as good as the saturated fats. So when I actually went looking at the literature for the miraculous benefit of seed oil and olive oil, it's simply not there. we can demonstrate that as a part of a healthy diet, it's healthier than a standard Western diet, but that really doesn't prove much. It's an incredibly low bar.
Tim, do you have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think that's very brilliantly, concisely explained by Paul. I think what I never knew until a few months ago was that the Mediterranean diet was developed by Walter Willett at a conference in 1993. He simply plucked it out of the air and then developed the Walter Willett pyramid, Mediterranean pyramid. And essentially, he said that you had to take meat out of the diet. So you're only allowed to eat meat once a month. You replaced the animal proteins with other beans and things like that. And then you added olive oil. And that was it. And it was in a period of time when Greece, Italy were struggling because the olive oil industry was failing and they needed to make it more popular. So they organized a series of conferences at which the top scientists, nutrition scientists in the world, went to the Mediterranean countries and had these conferences. And they were supported by other people. Sorry, I think you've lost me again.
No, keep going.
Okay. So they were supported by writers and journalists who would then go home and report on these fabulous Mediterranean diet. And if the journalists didn't report positively, they then got kicked off the group. And that's how the Mediterranean diet became very popular. It was completely commercially driven. And as Paul said, there wasn't any evidence to support it. And he's absolutely right. It's a halfway house. But it's really sad because I see recently there's studies on individual responses to carbohydrates. And the guys use the Mediterranean diet as their standard. And I asked why. And they said, no, that's the standard of care. Mediterranean diet is the standard of care for all patients. I said, but where's the evidence? And there is no evidence. And so Paul's completely correct. There is no significant evidence that the Mediterranean diet, however constructed, is more healthy for us than any other diet. Maybe than the American diet, the standard American diet, but not above anything else.
Go ahead, Gary.
Tim, Paul, Rod, everyone, I have a favourite question when I'm told about the benefits of the Mediterranean diet. I say, well, what is the Mediterranean diet? And because the Mediterranean, it's quite a big sort of ocean, and or sea, sorry. And is it a Portuguese diet? Is it an Israeli diet? An Egyptian diet? It is completely fabricated with different food sources. Sure, there may be an agenda, but nobody, and I realise Willett came up with this sort of contribution, but when you ask other researchers what the Mediterranean diet is, they don't describe what Willett described.
Yeah.
And so it is a complete myth. Again, it just falls over on the very first question. So when people say, I follow the Mediterranean diet, I say, well, what is it? And which part of the Mediterranean are you talking about? And so, again, I don't know how to debunk it any more than the fact that it's more non-science.
All right, thank you. Rod, I'm going to ask you a question. You've been doing low carb for a very long time, and one of the leaders in the field, really. Do you think supplements are necessary if you're eating low carb foods?
I suspect not, Doron. I mean, we've managed for thousands of years without having supplements. So I don't see a particular role. I do hear things like magnesium is very low in our soils because of our agricultural methods. And as a consequence, maybe there are things that we could supplement to advantage. And that's the only one I know, so I'm not sure, but just for good measure, I do take a small dose of magnesium every day. But I'd be interested in others' thoughts on this one.
Well, anybody want to make a comment there? Any of the other panelists?
I'll take the Dietitians Association line. A well-constructed, fully supervised diet plan, including veganism, by your dietitian will supplement and manage everything perfectly well, which is complete and utter BS. But I actually think if you eat tip to tail and you have a wide variety of low-carb foods, you don't need supplementation. But I completely agree with you, Rod, about the magnesium being deficient. Most fertilisers in the soil have got potassium, and potassium binds irreversibly to magnesium. And therefore, if you can't get the magnesium into your grass, you can't get the magnesium into the food. And if you look at the price of magnesium supplements in the last 10 years, they've just gone up and up and up at the chemists and supermarkets. So obviously a lot of people are taking it. Do you have to have it? I took it for a few years. I haven't had any for about 3 or 4 years now, but it's there in theory.
Paul, one of the other questions from the live chat here is about patients after having had bariatric surgery. Now, I know you've seen a lot of patients who have had bariatric surgery and then about 5 years later they tend to put a huge amount of the weight on again because they haven't changed what they're eating. And then they come to you with all sorts of deficiencies. Have you sort of got a little thought bubble of the typical things you see in those patients? We've lost you again, Paul.
Phone back on now. So it really depends on the type of bariatric surgery they've had. If they have a sleeve gastrectomy, that probably leads to significant degrees of nutrient deficiencies. You impair the secretory capacity of the some of the gut, and if you have impaired acid secretion, then that means you can't dissociate a lot of nutrients from the amino acids that come in. This is why proton pump inhibitors cause B12, magnesium and calcium deficiencies, amongst other things. So I actually like to do a complete nutrient screen on those patients, and you'll often find odd things. So had one patient who actually had a microcytic anemia that ended up being due to copper deficiency. I've had patients who come in with subacute combined degeneration, which is a neurological condition because of profound B12 deficiency. So the problem is not just that the surgery doesn't work and the patients don't lose weight, but they often end up with these terrible nutrient deficiencies that would normally only see in strict vegans or populations like this, and it's truly damaging to their health.
Did you want to comment on the vitamins as well? Sorry, Tim.
Sorry, can I just butt in there? Yeah, so as a diabetic, I've actually found that magnesium and zinc improve slightly my glucose control. So I've I've been studying my glucose for years, and there's no question that when I take magnesium and zinc, my glucose control is slightly better. I mean, it's a few millimoles better. It's always that way. And if I stop taking, the glucose control gets slightly worse. I do take vitamin D3 and K2 because I just think that they may have a role in coronary artery disease prevention and metformin. So I take perhaps a few more vitamins and minerals than other people do. But at least I convince myself that there's a role for me with my diabetes. Whether it's scientific or not, I don't know. But I'm an experiment of one, so I look at myself and see what happens.
Paul?
So one thing that I think is not discussed, and Gary alluded to it previously, was nutrient depletion in soil. And it's not just magnesium. There's multiple micronutrients that we don't even think of. There was one study they did in Australia that looked at the nutrient density of soil in the 1940s, and they compared it then to the same soil from the same locations in the 1990s, 50 years later. And they found that some nutrients had actually dropped down by about 75%. And I can assure you that when you speak to farmers, they're not replenishing all of those nutrients in the soil. And this should concern, everybody across the whole spectrum, from vegans, vegetarians, carnivores, omnivores, what have you. This actually impacts everybody. And I've got no doubt that monocrop agriculture, our modern agricultural techniques, are largely to blame. But the trouble is that every food that comes from that land, be it an animal-based food or a plant-based food, is effectively nutrient deficient compared to what it was 50 years ago. And remember, this data was from the 1990s, and now we're 30 years later again, 30 years more of nutrient depletion with, hydroponic setups and things like this. We've really, I think occasionally I flip-flop a little bit between whether I think supplements are a good idea, but there certainly are a couple of key ones which I think can be beneficial. But I would always recommend against fish oil supplements. Again, just because any oil, understand that fish oil is highly polyunsaturated. It is even more prone to oxidation than omega-6 fats. And immediately out of the bottle or out of the capsule, it's oxidized. If you want your omega-3 supplements, then get it from fresh food. The definition of rotten food rancidity is oxidation of oil. So if your fish is fresh, then the omega-3 fats are not oxidized. And if you're having pasture-fed beef, that too contains omega-3. So you don't have to be having salmon every day or sardines every day. So just natural is best, but sometimes it's not always possible.
All right, thanks, Paul. Tim, there's been a few fairly prominent fitness bloggers who, they're very pro keto for quite a period of time, and then all of a sudden they do a 180-degree turn and go vegetarian or vegan, saying that their insulin resistance got worse when they had been on keto for a period of time. Do you have any comments for us for those people?
Yeah, I think we must distinguish between pathological insulin resistance and physiological insulin resistance. So pathological insulin resistance is what I have, and I share that with all people with type 2 diabetes, in that it doesn't matter what diet we eat, our diabetes will always be there, or if we can put it into a high fat diet, we remain profoundly insulin resistant. The key is that in this profound state of insulin resistance, we simply can't tolerate more than 25 grams of carbohydrate per day. So our body can cope with 25 grams a day without requiring enormous amounts of insulin and distributing the carbohydrate into our muscles and our liver. So that's pathological, and you're not going to improve it. It's there for life. It's only going to get worse by eating a high carbohydrate diet. Physiological insulin resistance, however, is quite different. That's when a person is completely normal, that they have not got type 2 diabetes, their blood glucose control is perfect. When they take carbohydrates, their glucose spikes, but they've got sufficient insulin and the tissues are sufficiently insulin sensitive that the carbohydrate can be distributed into the tissues quite rapidly. And so they don't have complications. If we put them on a high-fat diet, their glucose tolerance will become worsened. So now if we were to do a glucose tolerance test, they would have to secrete more insulin and their glucose would go higher. But it's not material because they're eating so little carbohydrate anyway that they're not hypersecreting insulin all the day and they're not exposing themselves to high glucose. So it's not a problem. As I've indicated, it only becomes a problem when you have pathological insulin resistance. So I think people have to make that distinction. It's a terribly, terribly important distinction. And you're quite correct that people use that as an explanation why you shouldn't go on a high-fat diet. But the point is, once you're on a high-fat diet, you're not hypersecreting insulin, your blood glucose is better, and even if you're insulin resistant, it's not a problem. I want to just make the final point that people don't die of diabetes, they die of its management. And so if you have insulin resistance and diabetes, and you eat 25 grams of carbohydrate a day, you should be spared most of the complications of type 2 diabetes. We can't say you're going to be spared all of them, but we can say that you will probably be spared most of them because your insulin and glucose levels are going to be low most of the time. And that's what's important. So having type 2 diabetes, making your insulin resistance even worse, but not eating carbohydrate is the key to the management. Insensitive and you go on a high-fat diet, you're going to get lots of benefits, but you probably weren't going to get diabetes in any case. So the fact that you become slightly more insulin resistant, it's all physiological, it's all easy to explain, and it's not going to cause long-term disease.
All right, thank you. So a question from Rachel here. For those who want to monitor their metabolic health, is it best to look at the fasting insulin, the HbA1c, or both? And can you just tell us what are the levels indicative of insulin resistance? So Paul, maybe you could take that one for us.
Well, I think the fasting insulin was one that Ben Bickman covered in his lecture, and he believes a level of 6. And that's actually very close to the threshold which I use. I actually use a threshold of 5, so we probably read some similar literature there, funnily enough. I think it's important, though, to not discount the fact that the fasting insulin doesn't tell you anything about how the body handles a glucose load dynamically. So I think if you have the option of doing a Kraft test, that's always useful. I find the HbA1c can be useful to track progress over time in somebody who's poorly controlled, but it has an incredible amount of variables. For instance, if somebody has an iron deficiency state, that will artificially elevate their HbA1c, or if they've got an autoimmune state where their red blood cells are under autoimmune attack, that will artificially lower their HbA1c. And there's so many other factors that can impact HbA1c. I personally prefer a couple of key things that are done on standard blood tests for metabolic health: triglyceride to HDL ratio, fasting glucose, and fasting insulin will give you an indication in most everybody. And then certainly if there's any doubt at all, if anybody's in the grey zone, then there's a heck of a lot of other tests that we can do to find the nuance on things a little bit more.
All right, thank you very much. So another question, I'll go ahead, Gary.
Paul, do you do liver function tests and monitor your ALT in particular?
Absolutely. ALT is an amazing thing. So basically, you've got a liver cell, and it's got this enzyme in it, that particular chemical called ALT. If the liver is under stress, it's sick of dying, the liver cell will basically burst open, and the ALT will leak into the blood. We can detect this on a bloodstream. So it's a very good marker for liver health. And the interesting thing is, this is a perfect case of moving the goalposts. A lot of people, you go to your doctor, the doctor looks at the blood test and says, oh, it falls inside the reference range, it's not in bold, or it doesn't have a star, you get a big tick. But unfortunately, these reference ranges are set as statistical parameters. They reflect 95% of the population. So they're basically the values that you could 95% of the time expect a person from the street to fall within. It has no bearing to optimal health. It's just a purely statistical measure. So in the 1950s, the upper threshold for ALT was 25 or 30. And now, in some laboratories, it's over 40. So the simple fact is that as our population has gotten less metabolically healthy, rather than say, guys, we've got a problem, whatever we're doing is not working, we've just shifted the goalposts. But ALT is one of the single best markers. And absolutely, I do ALT, and it is very, very useful, and it's incredibly responsive to healthy diets.
Gary, being from Tasmania, the local salmon farming is probably not too far away from where you are. I don't know if you've had a chance to go down there, but I read an article not so long ago about all the nasty stuff that's fed to the farmed salmon. And that's why a lot of the omega-3 to 6 ratios and nutrients in the salmon are changing. Have you got any local knowledge for us from down there?
Well, be warned, Doron and Paul, I used to come from a place called Sydney, which started as a penal colony, so just remember that, guys. This has been looked at not just in Tasmania, but internationally. The omega-3, omega-6 ratios of pasture-fed meats, wild salmon, wild fish versus those that are farmed. And the majority, when you say all those toxic things that are fed to them, absolutely right. It's called grain, grain products. So the moment you introduce that, you do increase the omega-3, omega-6 ratios in a detrimental fashion, but it's very small. It's very small. I'd rather you have grain-fed meat or grain-fed fish than having the grain. So the ratios are a bit poorer than the wild fish and the pasture-fed meats, but they're still better than the vast majority of meats. Of other products that fit into those food pyramids and the food guidelines. So not everyone can afford to have pasture-fed meats. I'd rather you have meats and fish that are than not have them.
Now, Rod, there's been a few comments on the chat about the ethics of eating or farming meat versus the ethics of farming grains and other plant sources. Have you got any thoughts on on that for us? I can't hear you, Rod.
Hopefully that's better.
Yes.
This is a big question around sustainability. It's a big question around plant-based eating versus animals included in the diet. This is a complicated one. I think ideally, I'm personally a believer in including animal products in our diet. Because I think that's a much more complete diet with all the nutrients that are required. So that's my bias to start with. Sustainability is an issue for both animal-based agriculture and plant-based agriculture. By eating grass-fed meats, and I mean grass-fed and grass-finished, then we avoid the problems that we have for industrial methods of feeding animals towards prior to at the end of their lives. So lots of issues in here, but if we can use regenerative agriculture methods, then I think that's a great way to addressing sustainability for what I believe is a better diet. There are also problems with grain-based agriculture. There are a lot of negatives that go into that in terms of things that are added to the soil, herbicides and pesticides and the like. And there is also damage to animals, small animals, in harvesting. This is a huge question, Doron, but thank you. That's a little take on some of the issues that I see. Thank you.
Tim, I'm going to actually flick that across to you. In a country where there are a lot of poorer people who can't necessarily access the meats and proteins, can you give us some guidance as to how they can make their country healthier?
Yeah, thanks, Doron, because that was something that concerned us, and I have a small little foundation, and that's one of the questions we've tackled. And we developed a program called the Eat Better South Africa campaign, where we went into poorer communities in my town of Cape Town, South Africa, and we wondered, could we make these people healthier by eating a diet that they could afford? And we were able to produce a diet for $3 Australian a day that was healthy and complied with a low carbohydrate diet. And the focus was on tinned fish, eggs, dairy produce. They generally have access to lots of vegetables that's pretty freely available. And they then found ways to get hold of saturated fat from the more wealthy shops where they cut the fat off and throw it away. And so there were ways that they could render that fat and then use it. So on $3 Australian a day, we were able to show dramatic improvements in all the risk factors, the metabolic risk factors that we've discussed, that Paul has discussed earlier, within a period of 6 weeks. And the change was quite dramatic because these were people who are marginalized because they're in South Africa, and you know the South Africa's history. They were marginalized and they'd never had control of their own lives. And it reflected in what they were eating. And once they took control of what they were eating, the benefits were quite remarkable. You know, we had...
So it seems that we've lost Tim there again.
I'll take on from Tim. I was lucky enough, fortunate enough, invited to speak with Tim at the first LCHF summit in Cape Town. one of the most profound moments for all of us as speakers was actually travelling into the couple of the settlements. We had a day trip in there. Scary living conditions, but they had an open market, and in that open market was a wide range of offal that you would struggle to find any, well, Australian, US marketplace. So that they had lots of liver, lots of lung, heart. They had goat's heads, which a lot of us might find offensive, but they were eating tip to tail, and that was readily available in their open markets, and you didn't find, great big steaks and minced meat, and that offal, which is paramount with full of nutrients and having the bones, was actually it was available in the settlements, apart from the fact that every advertising sign was Coca-Cola. So you didn't see anything apart from Coca-Cola signage. But and Tim, I don't know if you heard any of that, but thank you once again. That was an incredibly eye-opening experience for all of us that came across, just to see an open market. So in those settlements, very poor, very clean, but they had their ability to get food which was actually very nutrient dense.
So, Paul, bringing it back to Australia, we have an incredible problem with our Indigenous population with their insulin resistance, diabetes, and all the complications. And I know that you did some work looking at the original native diets that they were eating, and what happened if you went back to those diets. So do you want to give a little bit of a comment on that? And then the second part of the question, if you want to just talk to me a little bit about omega-3 to 6 ratios as well, please.
Yeah, so essentially there's some research that was done by a researcher who obviously had a bias towards the food pyramid, and they had actually looked at what happened if they took groups of Indigenous Australians, the Aborigine, back to their native diet for a period of time. And what they actually found was that they had an incredibly rapid reversal of diabetes. In a matter of weeks, they were officially reversed. Now, the researchers' conclusion did not reflect that at all. So to actually understand that, I went to the studies and I actually calculated their macronutrient intakes, and I actually discovered that it was actually a relatively low carbohydrate diet, actually tending towards a very high protein diet, so tending towards the more carnivorous diet, actually what would see now. So the traditional diet, and when I went through and looked at the historical literature, they would eat foods like witchetty grubs, which are very fatty. They would actually, if they killed a kangaroo and the kangaroo was too lean, they wouldn't even drag it back to camp. That would just be left for the dogs and the dingoes. If they killed a wallaby, the fat that they would eat first, they would disembowel the animal and they'd eat the fat around the kidneys first. So they really prioritised, similar to what Amber talked about, they had a priority of their natural intake for fatty foods. And this natural diet, rich in fatty foods and protein, rapidly reversed diabetes. Now, to the second part of your question about the omega-6 to 3 ratio, I see there's a few comments about omega-3s and 6s and stuff like this. And I think that there's a little bit of a misunderstanding. People think that the ratio in and of itself is inherently important, and that's what confers your health status. If you have a high omega-6 to 3 ratio, that's bad. I actually think the reverse. I don't think omega-6s are good, but I believe the only deleterious thing about omega-6s is the fact that when the way we ingest them is that they're associated with a lot of oxidized products. So if we had omega-6s coming from fats and grain-fed animals even, those omega-6s are not necessarily going to cause us harm, because we worry about 6s, we say, well, that can lead to arachidonic acid, and that's the precursor for a lot of inflammatory substrates, eicosanoids and so on and so forth. However, this conversion from arachidonic acid to these inflammatory substrates only happens if you have an inflammatory trigger. And indeed, we've actually seen in research that if you go on a low-carb diet, the amount of arachidonic acid can actually increase. And that simply reflects that less of it is being converted into these downstream problems. So I would ask people to not focus too much on the 3 to 6 ratio, but just to make sure if you are eating 6s, make sure you're having 6s from healthy foods and it's not oxidized.
So there's a lot of people that talk about not eating chicken because chicken's very high in omega-6. relatively speaking. Is it a problem eating chicken?
No, I don't believe it is. Now, this does nothing to remove the need that the body has for omega-3. So it doesn't mean that you get away from having a bit of fish or pasture-raised meats or something like that from, to make sure that you're still meeting your essential fatty acid needs. But I don't think there's inherently wrong, and I actually agree with Gary. It's better if the animal eats the grains than we do. I don't believe that grain-fed animals are, particularly problematic for most people. So some people may benefit from sourcing organic foods, cleaner foods, pasture-raised foods and things like that. But when finances come into it, if the best you can afford is a chicken, then it's absolutely fine to eat the chicken.
Tim, I'm going to ask you another question, but did you have any comment about that as well? He's frozen. Okay, we'll come back to him. Gary, Rod, any comments about that? Are you back? Tim, did you hear Paul's comments about the chicken?
Yeah, I did. I don't really have anything to add to that. Thank you.
Okay, so the question then is, in the lean mass hyper-responders, they get a very significant increase in LDL. Could you give us your thoughts on what that, is there any worry about that in those people?
Who's that directed to?
I thought we would start with Tim, if you don't mind.
Yeah, I just don't think that.
Cholesterol.
I think that following on what Gary and Paul have been saying, it's the oxidized cholesterol that's the problem. That's what we need to be worried about. And so if you have a high cholesterol, but you're eating a diet that's not going to cause that cholesterol to become oxidized, then that's not a problem. There's so much evidence that high cholesterol is protective in many conditions that we need to remember that. But in my talk, I also focused on the Mr. Fit data, and it showed that the variance between a low cholesterol and a high cholesterol, the mortality difference is absolutely immaterial. It's completely, as I've said, it's immaterial. And so that the other point I made in my talk, which I hope gets across, is that diet has never been shown to be a determinant of blood cholesterol concentrations in a population. So that for an individual, there are many factors that drive cholesterol up or down that are completely unrelated to diet. And we've just completely ignored those factors. Because if you put people in a laboratory for 6 weeks or so, you can definitely lower their cholesterol if you give them a high polyunsaturated fat diet, which now we know is toxic for the reasons that Gary and Paul have spoken about. But in a population, the cholesterol is completely unrelated to what people are eating. So in my way of thinking, that disproves both the lipid and the diet heart hypothesis, because it shows you can't predict if someone has heart disease. How can you relate it back to diet when the diet's going to be so variable in the population and not driving their cholesterol values anyway? So I have yet to see any evidence that increasing your blood cholesterol on this diet is going to be dangerous. If it's oxidized LDL cholesterol, yes, then it's going to be a problem, but otherwise it's not. And the only way you're going to get the oxidized LDL cholesterol is from an inflammation and eating the grains and polyunsaturated fats that Gary and Paul were talking about.
So therefore, is it useful to actually monitor people's levels over time?
No, I don't think anyone should ever have the LDL cholesterol measured, and particularly not women, because it's then used as an excuse. You know how bad we are in medicine. I tell patients that if you have a if you have a cholesterol measured, you're going to have a coronary angiogram, and if you're going to have a coronary angiogram, you're going to have coronary artery stent or coronary artery bypass surgery. There are certain things in medicine you don't do, and coronary artery invasive operations are probably one of them in most cases, and stenting is another one. But it all starts with cholesterol, and if you measure your cholesterol, you're going to go down a pathway that is not proven to be beneficial to your health long term. And particularly in women, there's absolutely no evidence in the published literature that cholesterol has anything to do with coronary artery disease in women. And so And that's terribly important, because people use this model, the Ansel Keys model, that cholesterol causes heart disease, and then they just apply it to men, women, old people, young people. Everyone's the same, and that's simply not true. So there are much better tests to determine your health, and those are the ones that Paul described for insulin resistance and metabolic syndrome. That's what we should be focusing on.
Thanks, Tim. That's fantastic. Gary, you wanted to make a comment?
I think we've got to stop using the terms of cholesterol and LDL. In the standard testing of LDL, it's actually a subtraction equation. It's got it's not actually a measure of anything in the standard test that's done. And when you realise that the LDL particles are a spectrum of particles, of which the small dense ones are probably the ones most likely to oxidation, and for want of a better term, the big fluffy ones that are floating around our carriers, it's no wonder when we actually improve our health profile dietary that the big fluffy carriers are fine and the small damaging ones are reduced. The only way to effectively measure that nowadays is to do a lipid subfraction analysis. So in 2019, even the American Cardiologists Association said they should drop the LDL measurement and to ignore it. And so the major units in the world that are now studying cardiac risk factors, remember, nobody's ever died from cholesterol, nobody's ever died from an LDL particle, it's only ever at the best association data. So the big units now are now doing lipid subfraction analysis. And so if anyone's got questions about it, certainly before they take on a lifetime of statins, they should request a lipid subfraction analysis. And in Australia, it's about $80, depending on where you have it done. Incredibly cheap test. And I've had a couple of cardiologists say to me that would I stop screwing with their head, because I've got patients of mine that go to see them with an elevated cholesterol, elevated LDL. They want to put them on a statin, and then they come along at the same time with a lipid subfraction analysis, and it's completely undermined their thought process. And I've got a couple of cardiologists have come around to our paradigm based purely on that lipid subfraction analysis. Very useful test, available in most Western countries. And I realise it's not everywhere, but it's don't start a statin until you've proven it.
Go ahead, Tim.
Yeah, can I just say that in my talk, I started with that thing that we don't know the cause of coronary artery disease. We simply don't know the cause. And it's not cholesterol, because I made the point that if you treat patients with something that will lower their cholesterol by 30%, you essentially don't do very much to their risk for coronary artery disease. If cholesterol was the cause, you would reverse the disease and it would not appear. And that has never been shown. Conclusion is, we know the reasons for people developing heart disease, and Gary's spoken about them. The lipid subfractions are a reason, but they're not the cause. And you really need to understand that. And also, I referred to the Mr. Fit trial at length, which was this incredible study where they took the people at the highest possible risk for coronary artery disease. They modified all their so-called coronary risk factors, which are not risk factors. They are reasons for developing the disease. They are not the cause, and nothing happened. The only benefit was to stop smoking. So that's the basis. That's the evidence base on which we're giving all our nutrition advice about lowering cholesterol. We don't know the cause. We know that cholesterol is not the cause, but we don't know what the reason, the causes of coronary artery disease are. So the whole discipline of cardiology is based on falsehood, which has not been scientifically shown. And we have to get the people to understand that it's the only factors that we think might be linked to coronary artery disease are insulin resistance, high carbohydrate diets, and diets high in polyunsaturated fats. That's the best guess we have at the moment. But it's still a guess, but it's a lot better than the cholesterol guess.
Paul, I know you've been following the lipid subfractions for quite some time, and I know your thoughts have changed over time. Can you give us where you're at right now with the patients that you're treating, with the patterns of the subfractions?
Well, I guess I think my thoughts are essentially the same in terms of modified LDL is the LDL that potentially is atherogenic. That's if we have a healthy, what we call a native or a physiological LDL population, that does a job. It's there for a reason. But if that gets damaged in any way and that becomes the small dent stuff, then that potentially can get deposited on the inside of the walls. The interesting thing that I've been learning is that there's multiple stresses that all come down under the heading of glyco-oxidation. So sugar damage through glycation, oxidation damage, and eventually the formation of what we call advanced glycated end products. And these are actually synergistic processes. So the initial question you posed today was the relative deleterious nature of, say, fructose versus seed oils, or sugar versus seed oils. In actual fact, they work synergistically together to harm us. So this process of forming these advanced glycated end products, first of all, requires glycation, and the second phase of that process is strongly, not solely, but strongly driven by oxidation stress. And I've noticed that, say, a state of hemochromatosis, which is associated with increased oxidative stress, has increased oxidation of LDL. I've noticed that if somebody has a very high diet that's high in olive oil, this has been a very interesting thing for me. I noticed that you end up with a slightly modified LDL population, and often eliminating olive oil from the diet and replacing it with more saturated fats will then lead to normalization of that LDL peak into that normal native physiological curve. So it's this understanding that it's the balance of glyco-oxidative stress through a number of causes, a number of inputs. And I feel I probably should put a shout out there for the coronary artery calcium score. I see there's some questions coming up, and there'll be a very upset Irishman if we don't mention this. Yeah. Essentially, the LDL subfraction is actually a fantastic tool for seeing whether the LDL currently in your circulation has the potential to contribute to atherogenic plaques, but it doesn't tell you about history. And I think the coronary artery calcium score is a very, very good indication of giving us an idea of your overall cardiovascular risk. And I think it's certainly got much better predictive potential than any blood marker we could do. And certainly if I have any shadows of doubt about somebody's risk, then I have a low threshold for requesting a coronary artery calcium score.
So look, we're going to wrap up in a couple of minutes. If I could ask everybody, and I'm going to start with Rod and finish with Tim, to try and give us 30 to 45 seconds, I guess, of just some advice that you might give to somebody. And it doesn't have to be about anything specific, just something, a little thought of yours a useful tip that you found, something to do with low carb over the years. I mean, Rod, you've spoken to tens of thousands of people, run lots of conferences. Any just, a little bit of a thought process that somebody could take, be useful if they're thinking about keto or low carb type lifestyle.
Yeah, well, essentially, what we eat is very important, and we've got to be very careful to minimize processed foods. We also want to know how we're traveling. We want to have long and healthy lives. And to that extent, we want to speak to people, healthcare professionals, who understand nutrition and the roles of the whole food nutrition that we're talking about. So it's important to find out all you can. It's important to find people to help you along the road. It's important to get metrics done, including the coronary artery calcium score, which Paul's just alluded to, for those as we reach a certain age. So for a long, healthy life, these are some of the things we need to do.
Thanks, Rod. Gary, do you want to go next for us?
Two things. To explaining the whole concept, I talk about a wood fire. You've heard, a lot of people heard me talk about it. Into a wood fire, you've got a choice of putting kindling, branches or logs. The kindling burns hot and fast and requires opening and shutting the door a lot. And into our cells, they require acetyl-CoA, and you've got a choice of putting carbohydrates, proteins or healthy fats in. If you put in the carbs, you're going to be opening and shutting the door. That's called insulin resistance over a long period of time. So put in your branches and logs. It'll burn slow and steady, and all of a sudden you avoid health issues. in summary, LCHF by definition is eating fresh, local, seasonal food that doesn't come in a cardboard box or a plastic bag and doesn't have a label on it. So if that's ever considered dangerous, then we're all in deep bother, because that's all we're advocating: fresh, local, seasonal food. And the other two analogies I try to get through to my patients every day, and it seems to work in getting the message across. I know that LCHF works, but the message is what we're trying to get across. Thank you.
Great. Paul?
Look, so I might let somebody else go first, because I've just got an announcement or two to finish this off with as well.
All right. Well, look, but before I go to Tim, Carl Franklin's in the background, and he's been doing a fantastic job. So, Tim, why don't you give us your words of wisdom, and I'll let Paul wrap things up after that. But thank you all for being wonderful panelists and answering the questions.
Yeah, thanks, Doron, and thanks everyone for allowing me to participate. It's been very illuminating, and I've learned a substantial amount from everyone today. So thanks very much for that. Okay, so I was the original guy who promoted the high carbohydrate diet, which almost killed me. And I then realized that I was on the road to disaster and managed to change. And all I can say is that I have absolutely no doubt that the most important change you can do in your life is to eat the low carbohydrate diet. It is crucial, and it's vital for our profession to acknowledge that and to start promoting it, and not to continue making people unhealthy by promoting diets that are profoundly unhealthy and are now known to be unhealthy. So my message is very simple. Get into the low carb lifestyle, because it's going to change your life and improve your health dramatically. And there is nothing that is as powerful as a low carbohydrate diet to improve health. Medicine has found nothing that is superior to that. So that's my message. And thanks again for allowing me to participate in this remarkable conference.
Really, truly words of wisdom, and I think that's very important. So, Paul, why don't you wrap up for us before we go back to the live stream?
Well, I think that the more I look into this, health is more than just one isolated macronutrient or micronutrient. It's the whole package, and it's diet. And I was absolutely fascinated with Tim's talking about how early in history we started having deviations from a natural diet, how early these polyunsaturated fats actually come in, over 100 years ago. It's a lot later than, we tend to think about these things in terms of the 1970s, but this has been going on for a long, long time. And the closer we get back to evolutionary style diets, I think the better health we have. And it's not just diet, but it's an evolutionary style in lifestyle. So something like sun exposure, which here in Australia we're almost allergic to. We've got quite a strong public health messaging against all sun exposure. Certainly some sun exposure can be dangerous, but sun exposure at the right time of day and the shoulders of the day when the sun's low in the sky actually appears to be quite healthy. We probably don't promote an active lifestyle enough. We probably don't promote enough activity. We certainly don't promote sleep enough. And it's all of these pillars. We need to have good relationships, good sleep, good exercise, good diet. It takes all of them to be healthy. And certainly with my patients, it's not just a conversation about how many grams of carbs you're having. That's just such a minor part of being healthy as a person. Just with regards to, I'd like to thank everybody who's participated today. Everybody's been incredibly generous with their time and their effort in terms of putting all the lectures together and providing the content. And thank you, Tim. It's, as I said earlier, it's a combination of an editorial by yourself and by Peter Bruckner that was really quite formative for my journey. So I'd like to thank everybody for being involved.
All right. Thanks very much, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks, guys.
Thank you. Thank you.